So if you remember from principles of macroeconomics, an oligopoly is a market where a small number of firms are producing a very similar products, and they're competing with each other. Now, these small number of firms can either work together or compete with each other. If these small number of firms join hands to significantly increase their pricing, they become what's called a cartel. You see these cartels in the oil industry, for example. However, there are many laws in place to prevent these small number of powerful firms from colluding and forming a cartel. Antitrust law is one of them. And for this application, though, we will focus on the case where oligopolistic firms compete with one another instead of trying to collude and form a cartel. So how about other types of markets? A monopoly is not a good setting to study game theory because one firm or a monopolist decides on the price and the quantity to produce, and there's really no strategic competition. Likewise, a perfect competition. In this picture, you have an apple, and an apple that Walmart sells is very similar to an apple that Payless sells, for example. And a perfect competition is also not the best setting to study game theory because many firms are producing same or very similar products. And so one firm does not have much strategic power over other firms because of the sheer size of the market. If Walmart decides to lower the price of its apple by 1 cent, it's really not going to change the overall impact on the apple market. Now, a better setting to study game theory is oligopolistic markets, where a small number of firms are competing for a limited number of customers. Oli literally means small, and poly means sellers. And Coke and Pepsi is an example. And this product market is called a duopoly because you have two firms, Coke and Pepsi. And in most of our examples, we will only look at these duopolies where there are only two firms that are strategically interacting to either set price or quantities produced to maximize their profit. So to study duopoly, I'm going to make some simplifying assumptions. So imagine a market where there are only two firms, firm A and firm B, that produce an identical or an almost identical product. The quantity demanded of this product by consumers is Q, and Q is a combination of QA and QB, which are quantity produced by firm A and firm B. There's an inverse demand function for this product, which looks something like this: P price equals constant A minus B times total quantity, Q, where price P decreases if there are more quantities, Q, produced. So you can think of this as, if you have more supply, then and the demand is fixed, then price decreases, right? Now recall that a firm's profit, pi, is revenue minus cost. Revenue is calculated by multiplying price times quantity minus marginal cost times quantity. So firm I has control over its own price, Pi, and quantity, Qi, to maximize profit. So there are two kinds of duopolistic competition. And the first one is where they compete on the number of quantities to produce. So this is the quantity setting duopoly. So firms can choose quantity to affect price since they can significantly produce a share of the market demand, Q. Now this is in contrast to perfectly competitive markets where one firm changing its quantity doesn't really affect the overall Q because it's just so large. The market is so large. But in a duopoly where only two firms are really producing the overall supply, one firm changing quantity will have a significant effect on the price. To illustrate this idea, imagine a imaginary world where you have people demanding 100 billion sodas a year. Now, let's say Pepsi and Coca-Cola are producing 100 billion a year, but then somehow Pepsi decides to lower its quantity produced, and they only produce 70 billion. Now, you can see immediately that the demand is 100 billion, but the total number of sodas for that year is only 70 billion. So Pepsi making a decision to lower its volume of production has a significant effect on the price because the demand is much higher than the supply in this case. The person who first came up with this concept of firms using quantities to affect price is a guy named Antoine Cournot. He first theorized that firms affect market price through setting quantities simultaneously. So you can think of this as firms kind of thinking ahead of what the demand would look like and producing perhaps 6 months or a year before the actual time of selling their products. So this is called the Cournot competition. Now, in contrast to the Cournot competition, there's also a duopoly where firms set prices. So firms can choose price given the overall demand queue in the market. So they have no control over the queue in this case. They just set the price. Okay, to illustrate what this looks like, imagine you're standing in front of Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and you really have no preference over which soda you want to drink. Imagine Pepsi charges a slightly higher price than Coca-Cola. Then you would only want to drink Coca-Cola because obviously you want to save as much money as possible. So then Pepsi, knowing that, would also lower its price to match Coca-Cola. And eventually their price would equal the same. And this is what the price-setting duopoly equilibrium predicts, that two firms would end up just setting the same price, which is equal to their marginal cost. And this is called the Bertrand competition. Because Bertrand read Cournot's argument about quantity setting, and he said, oh, no, there's another way where firms are competing and it's through price. And he said that firms, if they instead set prices rather than quantities, the equilibrium price will be equal to the marginal cost of the production. So I don't know about you, but this portrait of Bertrand looks like he's very proud that he was able to challenge Cournot. You can see it in his eyes. Yeah, he's having his aha moment, you know.